They voted to send my boy away, and one of them had a reason to want it.
Grady Boone had not touched the radio in 2 years. It sat on the kitchen counter where Ruth had always kept it, a squat thing, with a cracked plastic dial and a bent antenna she had fixed once with electrical tape and never replaced. Every morning he made coffee and looked at it and did not turn it on. Every evening he came home from the shop with grease under his fingernails and oil on his boots, and he looked at it again and still did not touch it. Owen sometimes looked at it too. Neither of them said anything about it. Some things in a house become monuments without anyone deciding they should be. That was the kind of house they lived in now. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the letter arrived. Grady had not seen it come in because he had been under a 1987 shovelhead until 6 in the evening, and when he got home, Owen was already at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal he had made himself, which he did most nights now because cereal was something Owen could manage without anyone making noise around him. The envelope was on the counter next to the radio. Owen had put it there. He had not opened it. Owen never opened things that did not belong to him. Grady washed his hands at the sink, dried them on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and picked up the envelope. It was from the Millhaven Unified School District. He opened it standing at the counter. He read it once, then he read it again more slowly. Then he set it down and stood very still with both hands flat on the counter and looked at the window above the sink, which showed him nothing but his own reflection in the darkness outside. The letter informed him that the Millhaven School Board had voted 5-2 in favor of transferring Owen Boone, currently enrolled in 3rd grade at Millhaven Elementary, to the Hargrove Learning Center in Denton County. The Hargrove Learning Center was a specialized educational facility better equipped to serve students with Owen's needs. The transfer would take effect in 30 days unless a formal appeal was submitted in writing and approved by the full board. Enclosed was the appeal form. Grady did not move for a long time. Behind him he could hear Owen eating. The small sound of the spoon against ceramic. The sound Owen always made when he chewed, which was barely any sound at all, because Owen had taught himself to eat quietly the same way he had taught himself to do most things, which was by watching what caused problems and removing it. Owen was 9 years old, and he had already figured out that the world ran more smoothly when he took up less of it. Grady turned around and looked at his son. Owen was looking at his cereal. He had a small wooden cube in his left hand, turning it in the slow, deliberate way he always did when he was eating, or thinking the motion so habitual, it had become invisible to both of them. Ruth had made it for him in the last month of her life, sanding it smooth with the fine-grade paper she kept in the drawer under the bathroom sink rounding the corners, so there were no edges to catch. She had not told Owen what it was for. She had just put it in his hand one afternoon, and he had held it ever since. Grady had tried once to understand what it did for the boy. Owen had looked at him with those gray eyes and said it makes the loud quieter. That was the most Owen had ever explained himself to anyone. Grady folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer beneath the dish towels. He did not tell Owen, not that night. He sat down across from his son and they ate together. Owen with his cereal and Grady with the cold sandwich he had not had time to eat at lunch, and they did not talk because they did not always talk at dinner, which was one of the things Grady had learned in 9 years of being Owen's father. Silence at the table was not absence. It was just a different way of being in the same room. Later, after Owen was in bed, Grady sat in the kitchen alone. The letter was in the drawer. He could feel it from across the room, the way you can sometimes feel something you are trying not to think about, a low weight at the edge of everything. He reached over and turned on the radio without thinking about it, the way you do something automatic when your mind is somewhere else entirely. The first note came through the cracked speaker, and his hand snapped back to the dial and turned it off before he fully knew what he was doing. The kitchen went silent. His hand was shaking. He set it on the table and looked at it until it stopped. Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Always that one. Ruth had found the song on a road trip when Owen was 3. They had been driving through West Virginia on a 2-lane highway in the rain, Grady on the Harley and Ruth and Owen in the truck behind him, Ruth playing music through the truck, speakers with the windows cracked, so Grady could hear it faintly when they stopped for gas. Owen had been in the back seat in his car's seat, which was usually an ordeal because the motion of the car and the road noise made him difficult. But Ruth had put on that song and turned it just loud enough, and Owen had stopped crying and sat completely still, looking out the window at the rain on the glass, holding his hands in his lap like a little old man thinking about something important. That evening, they had stopped at a diner in a town called Grafton, and Ruth had taken Owen into the kitchen while Grady talked to the owner about the Harley parked outside. And when he came in, he had found them in the narrow space between the counter and the freezer, Ruth holding Owen's small hands in hers, swaying. The song was playing on a radio the cook kept on the shelf above the grill. Owen was not crying. He was not covering his ears. He was moving with his mother in that small space, his feet not quite keeping time, but trying, looking up at her with an expression Grady had not seen on the boy's face before, and could not name until later, which was simply the expression of someone who has found a room that fits them exactly. When Owen was 5, Ruth had started playing it in the kitchen in the mornings. She would put it on low while she made his oatmeal, and he would come downstairs still in his pajamas and stand in the kitchen doorway and listen before coming in. She told Grady once that she believed Owen needed to hear it first thing because it sets something in him like tuning a string to the right pitch before you start playing. Grady did not fully understand that then. He understood it better now. After Ruth died, he had taken the song off everything. His phone, the laptop, the small portable speaker Owen used in his room. He had told Owen the speakers were broken when Owen asked, and Owen had looked at him with those gray eyes for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and then had gone back to whatever he was doing. Grady still did not know if the boy had believed him or had simply decided not to argue. With Owen, it was sometimes impossible to tell. That was 2 years ago. Since then, the kitchen had been quiet. He sat at the table for another hour after he turned off the radio. He thought about the letter in the drawer. He thought about Hargrove Learning Center, which he had never heard of before tonight and which he now needed to learn everything about. He thought about the fact that the vote had been 5-2, which meant 5 people on the Millhaven School Board had looked at his son's file and decided that Owen Boone did not belong where Owen Boone had been for 3 years. He went to bed at midnight. He lay on his side of the bed, which was the left side, because Ruth had always taken the right, and he looked at the ceiling and thought about what "don't make him small" meant in practical terms when the school district had just told you your son needed to go somewhere else. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he called the school. Principal Hogan's assistant told him the principal could see him Thursday at 4. Grady said he would be there. He hung up and went back under the shovel head and worked for 6 hours without stopping, except to hand a wrench to his part-time guy Lester twice. When he came up at noon, his back hurt and his knees hurt, and he had not thought about the letter for approximately 40 minutes, which was the longest he had gone since reading it. Thursday came. Grady put on the one pair of pants he owned that did not have grease on them and drove to Millhaven Elementary in his truck, leaving the Harley at the shop because he wanted to make a particular kind of impression, which was not the impression a man on a motorcycle with Iron Saints MC on his back typically made at a school. He wore a dark shirt with buttons. He left the patch at home. He combed his hair. Principal Hogan's office had a window that looked out onto the playground and a desk that was very clean. Hogan was 50-something with the particular manner of a man who had delivered difficult news so many times that he had built a whole professional vocabulary around making it sound like something other than what it was. He shook Grady's hand with both of his and said he was glad Grady had come in and that he understood this was a lot to process. Grady sat down and said, "What did you base this on?" Hogan opened a folder. He had assessments from 2 specialists, he said. Scores on standardized measures of adaptive behavior. A report from Owen's current teacher, Mrs. Galloway, noting that Owen had 3 significant distress episodes in the last semester alone, each requiring one-on-one intervention. He laid the papers out on the desk with the careful patience of a man who had prepared for this conversation. Grady looked at the papers. Then he looked at Hogan. He said, Hargrove Learning Center receives federal supplemental education funding at a per-pupil rate of approximately $9,000 annually. He said it the way you say something you have researched. He watched Hogan's face. He said, "You sit on Hargrove's advisory board." I looked it up. It is public record. Hogan's expression did not change in the way an innocent man's expression changes. It stilled, which is different. He said that his role on the advisory board was entirely separate from his professional responsibilities as principal, and that the recommendation had been made on the basis of Owen's educational needs and nothing else. Grady looked at him for a moment. He picked up the papers and read the top one. He read all of it. Then he set it back down. He said, "I am going to appeal." Hogan said, Of course, that was his right and slid the appeal form across the desk. Grady took it, stood up, and left without shaking the man's hand again. He sat in the truck in the school parking lot for 10 minutes before starting it. He was not ready to be driving yet. He looked at the appeal form on the passenger seat. 30 days. He thought about $9,000 per pupil per year and what that did to a man's math when he was sitting on an advisory board. He thought about Owen at home right now, probably at the kitchen table with his cereal and his wooden cube, unaware that his principal had decided he was better handled elsewhere. Then he thought about what Ruth had said. Not the version he remembered in the polished, edited way you remember things people said when they were well and healthy. The real version. The version from the hospice room at the end when she was thin and her voice was different and she held his hand with both of hers and made him promise. Don't make him small. The world will try. Don't you do it too. He started the truck and drove home. The week before the wedding, Owen had asked 3 times whether they were going. The first time was at breakfast. He had looked up from his oatmeal and said, "Are we going to Dottie's wedding?" Grady had said, "I don't know yet. Buddy, let me think about it." The second time was that evening, unprompted, while Owen was brushing his teeth. He came to the bathroom doorway and said it again. Grady had said, "Let me think," same answer. The third time was 2 mornings before they were supposed to leave, and Owen had said it differently. He had said, "I told Mom I would go." Grady had been pouring coffee. He put the pot down. He said, "What do you mean you told Mom?" Owen said at the hospital, when she was still awake a lot, "I told her I would go to Dottie's wedding and I would dance." She laughed. "I want to go." Grady stood at the counter for a moment. He said, "Okay." He said, "We will go." That afternoon, he packed the bag he always packed for Owen at events. The noise-canceling headphones, the kind that sat fully over the ears and reduced the world to something manageable. The wooden cube. The leather wristband Grady had made himself at the shop with Owen's name burned into the front, and Grady's cell number stamped into the back in case Owen got overwhelmed and needed to find help that wasn't his father. A change of clothes, 2 granola bars Owen would eat, and 2 Owen would not, but Grady packed them anyway. He also packed a small photograph, which he tucked into the front pocket of Owen's bag without mentioning it. It was a picture of Ruth and Owen in the kitchen, Owen maybe 5 years old. Both of them mid-sway, Ruth's eyes closed, and Owen looking up at her with that expression Grady could never fully name. He did not know if Owen would find it or want it. He packed it in case. Dottie was his sister, Karen's daughter. Karen had died of the same cancer as Ruth 5 years before Ruth, which was the kind of statistical cruelty that did not get easier to say out loud, no matter how many years passed. Grady had helped raise Dottie in the years after, not in any official way, but in the way that family fills the gaps when someone is gone. She had grown up half in her stepfather's house and half at Grady's kitchen table, and when she had sent the wedding invitation, she had written at the bottom in her own handwriting, "Please bring Owen. He is my family too." She was getting married in a converted barn outside of Millhaven, deep in Pennsylvania farm country. White lights strung from beam to beam, a wooden floor put down over the original boards. 300 guests. Her husband was a good man named Terrell Weaver, who had met Dottie at a county fair 4 years ago and had, according to Dottie, bought her a corn dog and then just never left. Grady drove them out on a Saturday in late October. The Harley loaded Owen in the passenger sidecar configuration they had rigged 2 years ago, when Owen had said he wanted to see where they were going instead of just feeling it. The sidecar was something Grady had built over a summer, welding and grinding and refining until it sat exactly right, because Owen could manage road noise and wind when he could see the horizon. It was one of the accommodations they had built into their life together, a small engineering solution to an enormous emotional problem, which was the method they used for most things. The barn was 40 minutes out. When they pulled into the gravel lot, Owen had his headphones on and was looking at the barn with the expression he used when he was assessing something, which was very still and very focused, like a cat watching something it had not yet decided what to do about. Grady parked in the section roped off for motorcycles. There were 5 other bikes from Iron Saints already there, Walt Riggs among them, and a few bikes from other clubs Grady knew casually. He helped Owen out of the sidecar and straightened the boy's collar. Owen was wearing a button shirt and dark pants that Grady had bought 2 days before because Owen's dress clothes from last year were too small. Owen had stood in the dressing room and allowed the trying on without complaint, which was not always guaranteed. Grady said, "You okay?" Owen said how many people? Grady said about 300. Owen held the wooden cube loosely at his side and considered that. He said okay. They walked to the entrance together. The first thing Grady did when they came through the barn doors was count. This was something he had done unconsciously in crowds since Owen was small. A tally of the room, the exits, the sound sources, the distance between where Owen was and where the nearest quiet place might be. 300 people, give or take. Long tables arranged in rows with cream tablecloths and small candles in glass holders. A bar along the far wall, staffed by a bald man with gray at the edges, who was already reading the room, the way certain people do, the ones who have worked in rooms long enough to understand them. A DJ booth in the far corner, equipment stacked and waiting. A dance floor in the center, wooden, catching the light from the white strands above. Owen put his hand on Grady's arm, and they walked to the far edge of the room where a table had been set aside for late guests. It was slightly removed from the nearest cluster of people, which was why Owen had chosen it. The boy had already done his own assessment. They sat. Owen set the wooden cube on the table in front of him and looked at the room. Clem Briggs, the bartender, watched them come in from behind his counter. He was 58 years old and had been working events like this one for 30 years. And he had a talent developed through long practice for identifying the people in a room who were carrying more weight than was visible. He saw the patch on Grady's jacket, Iron Saints MC, in faded thread, and he saw the way Grady walked, which was with the body of a man who occupied space and knew it but had learned to carry it carefully. He saw the boy with the cube on the table. He set a glass down on the counter and reached under for a fresh one and began polishing it without taking his eyes off the room. Within the first hour, Grady watched it happen 3 times. A woman in a blue dress guided her son in a wide arc around Owen's table when the boy stood up briefly to look at something near the dance floor. The woman did it without thinking, reflexively, the way you steer a cart away from something in the aisle without consciously deciding to. Her son looked back at Owen over his shoulder. A couple at the table nearest to them, 2 people in their 40s who had been seated by the placement cards, looked at Owen for a moment, and then at each other, and then gathered their things and moved to a different table. They did it quietly and with the particular dignity of people who believe they are not doing what they are doing. A group of teenagers near the wall, boys, mostly 15 or so, looked at Owen sitting very still with his cube, the gentle, focused stillness he used when he was processing a lot at once. One of the boys said something to the others. They laughed, not loudly, just enough. Grady felt each one. He had been feeling things like this for 9 years, and it did not get easier, it only got different. He had built a hide thick enough for himself for the patch on his back and the tattoos up his arms, and the way certain people looked at him when he walked into a room. He had made peace with being read wrong. But he had never built a hide for Owen. You could not do that for someone else. Nobody could. He kept his face even and his hands still on the table, and he watched Owen with the cube and looked at the room with that focused, assessing expression, and he thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer and about Hogan's face going still when Grady had said advisory board, and he thought about 5 votes to 2 and what that said about how many people looked at his son and decided he was a problem to be solved by someone else. Dottie found them about 40 minutes in. She was radiant in the way new brides are radiant, lit from some interior source, and she put her arms around Grady and held on for a moment longer than a quick hug. She pulled back and looked at Owen. She said, "Hey, you made it." Owen said, "You look nice." Dottie's eyes filled. She kept her smile. She looked at the table where Owen was sitting and said, "Is he okay?" Grady said quietly, "He is figuring the room out. Give him a few minutes." She nodded. She had grown up in the periphery of understanding, which was not the same as fully understanding, but was close enough. She kissed Grady's cheek and went back to the receiving line. The ceremony happened and was good. Dottie and Terrell said their words to each other with the slightly overwhelmed sincerity of people who have been waiting to say them and have now been given permission. And people around Grady cried in the way wedding guests cry, quickly and without embarrassment. Owen watched the whole thing from the far table with his hands in his lap and the cube set on the tablecloth in front of him. He did not cover his ears. The ceremony music was soft, and Owen could manage soft. It was after the first dance that things shifted. The DJ had played one slow song for Dottie and Terrell on the floor, which was beautiful, and which Owen had watched without difficulty. Then the DJ said what DJs say. Let us open it up. Everybody on the floor. The music changed, something with a beat. The volume went up 2 notches, then a third. The bass found the wooden floor and moved through it. Owen's hands came up. He pressed them hard against his ears, both palms flat, the cube still on the table in front of him. He was rocking now, not the gentle processing motion, but the harder kind, the kind Grady recognized from the bad years, the years right after Ruth died, when Owen had gone to a place inside himself that was very difficult to reach. It had taken 14 months to walk him back from that. Grady had learned things about patience in those 14 months that no one should have to learn. Grady stood up. Walt Riggs appeared from somewhere to his left, a big man, gray in his beard, 3 or 4 beers into the evening. He clapped a hand on Grady's shoulder and said his name. Grady, hey. Walt had not been to the shop in 3 weeks and had questions about the Indian rebuild and whether Grady had sourced the intake manifold yet. Grady said, Walt, I have to check on my boy. Walt looked confused and then turned to look where Grady was looking and said, oh yeah, sure, go on. He said it with the tone of a man who had just been told something slightly embarrassing. Grady did not respond to the tone. He was already moving. He was 20 feet from Owen and closing. He could see the boy hands over ears starting to rock from foot to foot even in his chair. He could see the teenagers near the wall looking again, and this time the laughing was less quiet. He could see Clem behind the bar, who had stopped polishing and was leaning forward over the counter with his face tight. He was going to make it. He was maybe 8 feet away. Then Owen looked up. Not at Grady, at something to Grady's left. Grady turned. A woman was crossing the floor toward Owen's table. She was perhaps 60, maybe a little older, with silver hair pinned up in a dark green dress that moved quietly when she walked. She was not hurrying. She walked like a person who knew exactly where she was going and was not afraid of the distance. Her hands were at her sides open, which Grady registered without knowing he had registered it. She stopped approximately 3 feet from Owen's chair. Not 2. 3. She did not reach out. She did not speak immediately. She simply stood with her hands open at her sides and let Owen see her. Grady stopped walking. Some part of him, something built in 9 years of watching strangers approach his son in all the wrong ways, recognized that this was not wrong. He stood very still. Owen was still rocking, still had his hands over his ears, but his eyes were open. He was watching her. She bent at the knees slowly all the way down to his eye level. Not leaning toward him, just down. She said something. Grady was 12 feet away over the noise of the music, and he caught only pieces of it, but he caught enough. She said, I am sorry it is loud. It hurts me too. Owen's hands came down half an inch. She said something about a brother. She said his name was Samuel. She said they used to go into quieter rooms when the music was too much. She said it the way you say something true, which is without decoration. Owen's hands came down another inch. She said, my name is Hazel. What is yours? Owen did not answer, but his hands were at his chest now. Behind Grady, Dottie's Aunt Linda had appeared at his elbow and was hissing something about whether someone should intervene. Grady said, stop talking. He said it without turning around. Flat quiet, the voice he used in the shop when someone was about to make a mistake with a tool. Linda stopped. The room around Grady had changed. The people nearest to Owen's corner had begun to notice. Maybe 30 of them. They were watching this silver-haired woman crouched on the floor talking to a boy who had been rocking and covering his ears. The teenagers near the wall had gone quiet. Clem was leaning so far over the bar counter that his rag had fallen to the floor and he had not noticed. Hazel said something else. Owen looked at her for a long time. Then he said one word. One word quiet enough that Grady could not hear it over the music. But he saw Owen's mouth move. He read it. The word was quieter. And Hazel nodded like that was the most reasonable thing she had ever heard and stood up and walked toward the DJ booth. Grady stood in the middle of the room and watched her go. He did not know who she was. He did not know why she had walked across a wedding reception toward a boy she had never met and crouched on the floor and spoken to him with her hands open. He did not know what she had said that had brought Owen's hands down from his ears. What he knew was that his son was sitting at the table now, still the cube picked up again and held in his left hand, and that the boy was watching the woman in the green dress cross the dance floor toward the DJ booth with something on his face that Grady had seen only a handful of times in 9 years. Owen was watching her the way he watched very few people, which was with his full attention without looking away. The DJ looked up when Hazel reached him. She spoke to him, and he looked uncertain, and she spoke again, and he looked across the room toward Dottie, who was watching from the edge of the dance floor. Dottie was already nodding. The DJ pulled up something on his laptop. He adjusted the volume down. He looked at Hazel, and she nodded. The music that started was so soft you could hear the floorboards under people's shoes. A ukulele, a gentle chord, and then a voice low and warm and unhurried beginning the melody that Grady had deleted from every device he owned 2 years ago and told his son the speakers were broken. Grady's knees went soft. He had not heard that song in 2 years. He had gone out of his way not to hear it changing stations when it came on the radio in the shop, leaving restaurants once when it had come through a speaker in the ceiling. He had not known how much weight he was carrying from not hearing it until this moment when he heard it again and his body told him all at once. Owen turned to look at him from across the room. And then Owen turned back to Hazel, who was standing in front of him, with her hand held out, palm up, not reaching, just offering. Owen looked at the hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the hand again. He put his hand on top of hers. Hazel closed her fingers around his, slowly giving him time to pull back. He did not pull back. She walked him to the dance floor the way you walk someone, somewhere important, not quickly, not pulling, just moving in the direction of the thing and trusting the other person to come along. She stopped at the very edge of the floor where the wooden boards met the barn's original stone foundation. Not the center, the edge. Owen stood beside her and looked at his feet, and then at the floor, and then at the other couple still swaying in the dimmer parts of the room. Hazel began to move, just barely. Side to side, the kind of motion that is less dancing and more simply being present in a body that is alive. She did not instruct Owen. She did not demonstrate and then look at him expectantly. She just moved and left space beside her. Owen stood still for 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then he began to bounce. Not side to side like Hazel, but up and down slightly, one foot then the other off the beat at first, and then finding something close to it. It was not graceful. It was not the kind of dancing that gets remarked upon at weddings. It was just a boy moving his body in a room with music in it, which was something Grady had not seen in 2 years. Grady was still standing in the middle of the room. He was aware of the people around him in a distant way, the way you are aware of weather when you are inside looking out. He could feel the crowd had shifted, that the people nearest Owen's corner had stopped their own conversations. He could feel Clem behind the bar, still leaning over the counter. He could feel 30 pairs of eyes doing what eyes do when something unexpected is happening in a room, which is follow it. He watched Owen bounce from foot to foot on the edge of the dance floor, the cube still in his left hand, the headphones still around his neck. He watched Hazel sway beside him unhurried, saying something low that Grady could not hear. He watched Owen's right hand, which had been clenched at his side, slowly open. And then Grady understood something that he had been trying to understand for 2 years. He was standing 10 feet back, and he was not moving. He was watching his son stand on the edge of a dance floor with a stranger finding his footing without anyone beside him. He had been trying to do this for 2 years, to stand back and let Owen try, and every time the world had been too loud or too fast or too unprepared for the boy, he had retreated and Grady had retreated with him. Tonight the world had for once made room. A woman had crouched on a barn floor and made room. And Grady was standing 10 feet back and letting it happen, and his hands were at his sides, and he was not going to cross the floor. This was what Ruth had meant. Not a grand gesture made once. Not a decision arrived at and finished. Just this. Standing here, keeping his feet still, letting Owen try. Then the song reached the part that Ruth used to hum, the particular swell in the middle that she had always responded to without seeming to realize she was responding to it, a slight lift in her whole body like something being remembered. Grady knew this part of the song, the way you know the specific quality of light in a house you grew up in without having to look for it. When it arrived, his chest did something he was not going to be able to manage in a room with 300 people in it. He turned and walked to the side door. The door opened onto a narrow covered porch and then onto the gravel lot where the motorcycles were parked. The air outside was cold in the way Pennsylvania October is cold, which is honest and direct. Not the damp, creeping cold of summer storms, but a clean, straightforward cold that tells you exactly where you are in the year. He stood on the porch for a moment and then walked to the bikes and put his hand on the seat of his Road King and stood there. He cried for about 90 seconds, not loudly. He had learned to cry quietly in the years since Ruth died, first because Owen was in the next room, and then because quiet had simply become his way. He stood with his hand on the bike and let it happen, and then he stopped and wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the gravel lot and the dark fields beyond the fence line and breathed the cold air until his chest settled. Inside, the song was still playing. He could hear it through the barn walls, thinned by the wood and distance into something softer than it was, which was actually easier. He thought about Ruth in the hospice room, the specific quality of the light in there, which had been winter afternoon light, pale and thin, through the blinds. Her hands in his, lighter than he expected, lighter than they had been even a month before. She had looked at him for a long time without speaking, and then she had said it. "Don't make him small. The world will try. Don't you do it too." He had said, "I won't." He had meant it when he said it. He still meant it. But meaning something and being able to do it were two different architectures, and he had spent 2 years trying to figure out where they met. He heard the side door open behind him. Clem Briggs came out with his apron still on and 2 bottles of water. He gave one to Grady without saying anything and stood next to him looking at the motorcycle row. He had put his jacket on over the apron, which gave him the appearance of a man who had made a practical decision quickly. They stood in silence for a while. The music from inside was audible but soft. Clem said 30 years working events. He said it to the gravel, not to Grady. Then he said, "I have never seen what I saw tonight." Grady looked at him. Clem said, "Your boy is still in there." "Still going." Grady looked at the barn wall as if he could see through it. He said, "Yeah." Clem stood another moment and then said, "I should get back." He went inside. The door closed and the music was muffled again. Grady stood by the bike. He opened the water bottle and drank half of it and then held it in both hands and thought. He thought about Hogan's face. He thought about the appeal form sitting on his kitchen counter because he had moved it from the drawer 3 days ago and still had not filled it out. He thought about the 30-day window and how many of those days he had already spent trying to find a lawyer who took educational cases and knew what a school board's conflict of interest looked like under Pennsylvania Education Code. He had found one. Her name was Patricia Voss, and she worked out of Harrisburg, and she had not returned his last 3 calls. He took out his phone. He looked at Patricia Voss's number. He had called it 4 times. He looked at the time on the phone, which was 9:42 in the evening, and he almost put the phone back. He called it. Inside the barn, on the edge of a dance floor, in the light of strings of small white bulbs, Owen was still moving. Hazel had told him about Samuel. Not the end of Samuel's story, not then just Samuel himself. She had described a man who had covered his ears at loud sounds and who had paced in circles when he was thinking, and who had a specific route he walked every morning for 20 years, because the sameness of it was a kind of music. She had said Samuel could not always explain himself, but that she had learned over a long time to understand him without the explanation, and that this was a form of knowing someone that most people never got to have. Owen had listened to all of this. Then Hazel had leaned down so her face was near his level, and she had said, "Sing it. Sing it for your mom. She can hear it." Owen had looked at the floor. He had looked at the cube in his hand. He had looked at Hazel's face, which was an unusual thing for Owen to do with someone he had met 20 minutes ago. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at a road sign when you are trying to decide if it is telling you something true. Then he started to hum. He hummed quietly under the actual song, a half-breath behind the melody, because he was finding it by feel rather than by knowledge. Then a few words barely spoken, more breath than voice. Somewhere over the rainbow. His voice was small and uncertain, and not in tune in any technical sense, and it was the most honest sound in the room. The people nearby heard it. Not all of them. The ones close enough, the ones who had already been watching, they heard it. A woman at a table 5 feet away put down her fork. An older man 2 tables back straightened in his chair. The teenage boy who had laughed earlier was standing near the wall with his hat in his hands now. He had taken it off without knowing he had done it. Clem, back behind his counter, was holding his rag in both hands without using it. The song played to its end. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of it, from start to finish. When it ended, Hazel leaned down one more time and said, "Thank you for the dance." Owen said clear enough that the people nearby could hear him, "Thank you for asking." The room responded the way a room responds to something it did not expect to feel, which was with soft, uncoordinated applause. Not a performance, not the coordinated clapping of a planned moment, just hands here and there coming together because something had happened that deserved acknowledging. Owen flinched at the sound. His hands came up slightly toward his ears. Hazel reached into her sleeve and produced a folded white handkerchief, small and squared with a letter embroidered in one corner. The letter S. She held it out to Owen. She said that was my brother's. His name was Samuel. He is not here anymore, but I think he would want you to have it. Owen looked at the handkerchief. He turned it once. He looked at the letter in the corner. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." Then she stood up slowly, her knees taking a moment with it, and she looked at the room. The room looked back. She gave a small nod, the kind that means nothing more than what it says. Which is all right, that is done. Carry on. The DJ waited 10 seconds and then brought the music back up gently, and people began to move again, and the room became a wedding reception once more. Hazel turned and held out her hand behind her. Owen took it. They walked to the side door together. Outside, Grady had the phone to his ear. He heard the door and turned. Owen crossed the gravel without hesitating and walked straight to him and lifted both arms. Grady held up one finger and Owen waited, which he did, because Grady had always been honest with him about 1 minute, meaning 1 minute. Patricia Voss answered on the third ring. Her voice was awake and direct, the voice of a person who took late calls because the work required it. Grady said, "Ms. Voss, this is Grady Boone." He said, "I have 22 days, and I have a conflict of interest, and I have a video, and I need to know what to do with all three." She was quiet for 1 second. Then she said, "Tell me about the conflict of interest first." He told her. He told her about Hogan and the advisory board and the per-pupil funding and the 5-2 vote. He told her about the appeal form and the 30-day window. He stood in the cold gravel lot and talked to a lawyer in Harrisburg for 11 minutes, and at the end of 11 minutes, she said, "This is workable." She said she would need documentation. She said, "Can you be in my office Wednesday?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Bring whatever you have." He hung up. He looked at Owen standing in the gravel in his button shirt, the cube in one hand, the handkerchief with the letter S in the other, patient in the particular way Owen was patient, which was completely. Grady bent down and picked him up. Owen was small for 9 light, in the way that always surprised Grady even after years of knowing it, mostly bones and something determined running through them. He put his head on Grady's shoulder. He said into the side of Grady's neck, "I want to go home now." Grady said, "Okay, buddy." Hazel stood 6 feet off, hands clasped in front of her, giving them the space. After a moment, she said, "I am sorry if I overstepped. I should have asked you first." Grady shook his head. He could not speak yet. He shook his head again, and that was enough. Hazel nodded. She looked at Owen's face against Grady's shoulder. The eyes closed now, the cube held loosely, the handkerchief pressed flat in his other fist. She said, "I had a brother. He has been gone 21 years now. He passed when he was 34. She said it the way you say something you have said before, but never gotten used to saying. She said before that for 34 years he was my best friend. He covered his ears at loud noises. He hummed to himself when he was working through something. He liked dancing when the music was quiet. He did not speak until he was almost 7, and when he did, the first thing he said to me was, 'You have paint on your shoe.'" She smiled at that, just slightly at the corner of her mouth. She said, "Your boy looks like him." Around the eyes. Grady looked at Owen's face. He found his voice. It came out lower than usual. He said, "He is 9. He said his mother died 2 years ago." He stopped, took a breath. He said, "She made me promise. She told me don't make him small." Hazel looked at him steadily. She said, "My mother spent 30 years saying no to Samuel because she loved him too much to watch him get hurt. She kept him home. She kept him safe." She paused. She said she kept him small. Grady was quiet. Hazel said, "The last thing my mother said to me near the end was that she should have let him dance more. She said it the way you say something you have been holding for a very long time and are finally putting down. Not with drama, just plainly, which made it heavier than drama would have." Grady did not say anything. He held Owen a little tighter. Owen shifted his head slightly on Grady's shoulder, settling, and did not open his eyes. The side door opened and Dottie came out. She was still in her dress and her eyes were bright. She looked at Grady and Owen, and then at Hazel, and she seemed to take in the whole shape of what was happening in the gravel lot. She held out her phone to Grady. She said, 3 people sent me this tonight. People I barely know. On the screen was a video clip. Grady looked at it. It was Owen on the edge of the dance floor, the cube in his hand, his feet beginning to move, and then his mouth opening. 30 seconds of a boy who had been covering his ears 40 minutes ago, now moving with the music, singing soft and off-key, and completely unaware of being watched. The people visible in the background of the clip had gone still. Dottie said, Uncle Grady, show this to the board. Grady looked at the screen for a long time. He looked at Owen's face in the video, that particular expression of a person who is not thinking about being watched, who is simply somewhere else entirely, somewhere warmer than the room he is standing in. He looked at his son singing Ruth's song in a barn in Pennsylvania. He said, yeah. He said it quietly to himself as much as to Dottie. He said it the way a decision sounds when it has already been made and just needed a moment to become words. Hazel said, if you are going to appeal the board's decision, you want evidence of what he can do, not what he cannot. She said it carefully, like she was handing him something fragile. She said, when I fought for Samuel, I went in with grief. I told them what he had lost, what had been taken from him. She paused. She said they were not moved by grief. They needed to see what he was capable of. Grady looked at her. He said, you lost. She said, I know what I would do differently. Grady shifted Owen in his arms. He said, tell me what you know. Hazel said, not here. She looked at Owen, already drifting towards sleep, on Grady's shoulder. She said, take him home. Let him sleep. But she paused, choosing the words. She said, you are fighting a man who has a financial reason to want your son transferred. You are not going to win on emotion. You need documentation of progress. His teacher's observations. His therapist's notes, if there is a therapist. Any measure of growth from the last year, anything that shows the current placement is working. And if you can show them what happened tonight, she gestured at Dottie's phone, show them, that in the right conditions, he does things they said he cannot do, that is not a small thing. Grady said they will say a wedding is not a school. She said they will. And you will say that what a child can do in one room, he can learn to do in another if the room is built right. She said it the way someone says something they have worked out over a long time. She said, I was not able to build the right room for Samuel in time. His mother and I thought we were protecting him. We were. But we were also deciding for him what the world would be. She stopped. She said, I do not tell you this to make you feel a certain way. I tell you because you are clearly a man who knows how to build things, and the thing Owen needs is not someone to fight for him in a room. It is someone to build him a room he can actually live in. The cold air moved through the gravel lot. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a horse made a sound and then went quiet. Grady said, who are you? Not suspiciously, just the question honest, because he genuinely wanted to know. Hazel said her full name. Hazel Crane. She said it the way you give a name to someone you do not expect to see again but want them to have it anyway. She said, my nephew teaches in Denton County. I have heard Hargrove's name more than once. She did not say more than that. She said, what is your appeal deadline? He said, 22 days. She said, that is enough time if you move. She said, find someone who knows Pennsylvania Education Code on conflict of interest. Do not go in arguing that Hogan is corrupt. Go in showing the board what it looks like when a man in his position votes to transfer a child to an institution he advises. Let them draw the conclusion. Let them feel like they are seeing something rather than being told something. Grady nodded. He was filing all of this the way he filed mechanical information, in the part of his mind that was organized and precise, the part that had kept him solvent through 15 years of running a one-man shop. Hazel said, and use the video. He said, I will. She looked at Owen's face against Grady's shoulder, the eyes closed, the cube loose in his fist, the handkerchief pressed between his palm and the wood. She said he was extraordinary tonight. Grady looked at his son. He said he is. He meant it without qualification, not as a defense of anything, not as a correction of someone else's assessment. Just the fact of it said plainly in a gravel lot in October. Dottie hugged Grady carefully around Owen and kissed him on the cheek. She squeezed Hazel's hand. She went back inside, pulling her wrap around her against the cold. Hazel turned toward the door. She stopped with her hand on it. She looked back and said, Grady. He looked at her. She said the next time he asked to go somewhere, let him try. She said it quietly, like the end of something she had been thinking through for a long time. Then she went inside. Grady stood in the gravel lot with his son in his arms. He stood there for a while. The fields beyond the fence were dark, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue of a clear October night, no moon stars everywhere. The motorcycles stood in their row chrome, catching what light there was. The bass from inside the barn moved through the walls in a low pulse, distant enough now to be abstract. He carried Owen to the sidecar and strapped him in with the care of a man who had done this 100 times and still did it with full attention. Helmet on, headphones on under the helmet, blanket from the side compartment tucked around his legs. He checked the buckle twice. He started the Road King and listened to the engine he had spent 2 years tuning quiet for his son until it settled into its running note. Then he pulled out of the lot and onto the country road and went home. He got Owen to bed just past 11. The boy had woken briefly when Grady lifted him out of the sidecar, opened his eyes and looked at the house, and then closed them again, which was his way of saying he recognized where he was and did not need to be alert. Grady carried him up the stairs and laid him on the bed and took off his shoes and pulled the blanket up. He set the headphones on the nightstand. He looked at the handkerchief in Owen's hand, thought about whether to leave it, and left it. The cube he left too. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment. Owen said without opening his eyes, "I danced." Grady said, "Yeah, buddy, you did." Owen said, "Mom knew I would." Grady stood in the doorway. He said she did. Owen was asleep again before Grady had finished saying it. He went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. The appeal form was on the counter where he had moved it 3 days ago. He pulled it toward him and read it again, all of it, because reading things completely was how he avoided missing things. The form asked for a written statement of grounds for appeal and supporting documentation and gave him 6 lines with a note that additional pages could be attached. He thought about what Hazel had said. Do not go in arguing that Hogan is corrupt. Go in showing the board what it looks like when a man in his position votes to transfer a child to an institution he advises. Let them draw the conclusion. He got up and made coffee, which he did not drink. He just needed something to do with his hands while he thought. He stood at the counter and looked at the radio. After a while, he sat back down and opened his laptop and began to write the statement. He wrote badly at first, the way you write when you are too close to something. He deleted 2 paragraphs and started again. He wrote about Owen's enrollment at Millhaven Elementary and the 3 years of placement there, and the progress notes he had collected from Mrs. Galloway over the past year, which documented improvement in sustained attention and a reduction in distress episodes from the previous year's count. He wrote about Hogan's role on Hargrove's advisory board in the per-pupil funding structure and the fact that this information was available in public records. He wrote it the way Hazel had described, laying out the shape of the thing and letting the shape speak. He wrote for an hour and a half. When he stopped, the coffee was cold and the clock said 12:47, and the statement was 4 pages. He knew he would revise it with Patricia Voss on Wednesday, but the bones of it were there. He closed the laptop. Then he reached over and turned on the radio. He did it deliberately this time. Not automatic, not accidental. He turned the dial and put his hand flat on the counter and waited. The radio found a signal, a station that played older music in the small hours for the people who were still awake. It was not the song. It was something else, a piano piece he did not recognize, quiet and unhurried. He listened to it. Then he stood up in the kitchen and he danced. Not for anyone. Not because the moment required it. Just because he was in the kitchen at 12:47 in the morning after a night that had done something to him that he did not yet have words for. And his son had danced tonight, and his son had said, "Mom knew I would," and the only response his body had to all of that was to move. He moved without grace the way a large man moves alone in a kitchen in the dark, and he did not care. He swayed through one song and into another, and then the radio drifted, and he reached over and turned it off and stood in the quiet. He said to the kitchen and the dark and whatever might be listening to things said in kitchens at midnight, "I am working on it." Then he went to bed. Wednesday, he drove to Harrisburg. Owen was in school. Patricia Voss's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on State Street, small and dense with files, the desk covered in a way that suggested organizational systems invisible to anyone else. She was 50, sharp-eyed, and shook his hand without excess. She had the manner of someone who did not waste time on the preamble to things. He gave her what he had, the appeal form with the 4-page statement. Copies of Owen's progress notes from Mrs. Galloway going back 2 years. A printout of Hargrove Learning Center's Board of Advisors from their website with Hogan's name on it. A printout of the federal supplemental education funding allocation for Denton County, which named Hargrove as a recipient facility. He laid them on her desk in the order he had assembled them. She read everything. She did not speak while she read. She made 3 marks in the margin of the funding document with a pen. Then she said, "Show me the video." He put his phone on the desk and played the clip Dottie had sent him that morning. 30 seconds. Owen on the edge of the dance floor, the cube in his hand, his feet beginning to move, his mouth opening. She watched it twice. She said, "Where was this taken?" He said, "His cousin's wedding. Last Saturday." She nodded slowly. She said, "The board is going to say this is a controlled environment. A wedding is not a classroom." He said, "I know." She said, "Here's what we say back. We say that Owen's demonstrated capacity for sensory regulation in a social environment, when that environment is appropriately structured, is evidence that his current educational placement with proper support can be adapted to meet his needs. We say that transferring him to a specialized facility is premature because the record does not show that adequate environmental adaptations have been attempted and failed." She paused. She said what adaptations have been made at Millhaven Elementary. He listed them. The noise-reducing earmuffs Mrs. Galloway kept in her desk for Owen. The seating arrangement that put Owen near the window and away from the hallway door. The 10-minute transition period before lunch that allowed Owen to leave the classroom before the hallway filled. The communication card system Mrs. Galloway had developed herself without any request from the district. Patricia Voss was writing while he talked. She said all of that needs to be in Galloway's statement. Every adaptation documented specifically with dates if possible. He said, "I will call her today." She said the conflict of interest is real, and it is documentable, but I want to be careful how we raise it. If we lead with corruption, we put the board on the defensive and they circle around Hogan. We raise it as a question of process. We ask the board to review whether the vote meets the standard of impartiality required by the district's own governance policy. She pulled a document from a drawer and slid it across the desk. He looked at it. It was a section of the Millhaven Unified School District Policy Manual, Governance Procedures, Board Member Conflicts of Interest. She had already found it before he arrived. He looked at her. She said, "I pulled this the morning after you called." She said, Section 4, Paragraph 3. Board members with financial or advisory relationships to institutions that may benefit from district decisions are required to recuse themselves from relevant votes. She said Hogan did not recuse. Grady read the paragraph twice. He said so the vote itself is procedurally compromised. She said potentially. Whether the board will acknowledge that depends on the board, but we are not asking them to call Hogan a criminal. We are asking them to look at their own policy and tell us whether it was followed. That is a much more comfortable question for a board to say yes to. He sat back in the chair. He said 5-2 becomes 4-2 if Hogan's vote is removed. She said, and a 4-2 vote for transfer is still a majority. She said it plainly, which he appreciated. She said, so we also need to win on the merits. We need the board to look at Owen's record in the video and Galloway's statement and decide that the current placement is working. He said, can we win this? She looked at him directly. She said, I think we can. I do not promise outcomes. But the conflict of interest issue gives us grounds to request a revote. And on a revote with everything we have, I think we have a reasonable chance of flipping at least one vote. He said, what do you need from me? She said Galloway's statement by Friday. Any additional progress documentation from the therapist if there is one. A signed authorization for me to request the full records of the board vote, including Hogan's disclosure forms. And you present and in person at the appeal hearing, which I will request be scheduled within the appeal window. He said, I will be there. She said, bring the boy if you can, not to speak, just to be present in the room. She said, boards vote differently when the child they are deciding about is sitting 10 feet away. He thought about Owen in a room with 7 adults discussing his future. He thought about what Owen could and could not manage. He thought about a 9-year-old boy who had read a letter on a kitchen counter and said nothing for 3 days because he did not want to add to his father's weight. He said, I will ask him. She said, you ask him. He said, yes. He said, I ask him about things that involve him. She looked at him for a moment in a way that was not skepticism, but something closer to recalibration. She said, all right, ask him. He drove back to Millhaven. He picked Owen up from school at 3:15. Owen got into the truck and put his backpack between his feet and looked out the window. Grady drove for a few minutes without speaking. Then he said, I want to talk to you about the hearing. Owen said, the one about my school. Grady said, yeah. Owen said, okay. Grady said there is going to be a meeting with the school board. The people who voted to send you to a different school, I am going to tell them why that is wrong and why you should stay at Millhaven. He said, my lawyer thinks it would help if you were in the room. Not to talk, just to be there. Owen was quiet. He was turning the cube in his lap. He said, would it be loud? Grady said, no. A conference room. Maybe 8 or 9 people. Quiet. Owen said, would I have to look at them? Grady said, no. You do not have to do anything except be there. Owen thought about it. He looked out the window at the fields going by. He said, will you be there the whole time? Grady said the whole time. Owen said, okay. He said it simply and went back to looking out the window. And Grady drove and did not elaborate because Owen had said okay and that was enough. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular quality of time when you are working towards something that matters. Not fast, not slow, purposeful. Mrs. Galloway's statement came in on Thursday, 4 pages typed, specific with dates, and a detailed accounting of every environmental adaptation she had put in place for Owen over 3 years. She had done it on her own time and had it notarized and sent it to Patricia Voss without drama. Owen's therapist, Dr. Elaine Frost, provided a clinical summary that documented a measurable reduction in distress frequency over 18 months of sessions and made specific reference to Owen's increased capacity for self-regulation in novel environments. She had chosen that phrase deliberately, she told Grady when he called to thank her. She wanted the board to understand what novel environments meant in practice. Grady filed the conflict of interest request through Patricia Voss, and the district's response came back in 4 days, careful and lawyerly, acknowledging that the matter of recusal procedure would be reviewed prior to the appeal hearing, which meant Patricia Voss explained when she called that they already knew they had a problem. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 18 days after the wedding. The night before Grady sat at the kitchen table, the folder of documents was assembled and ready. Owen was upstairs. The house was quiet. He turned on the radio. It played for a while, songs he half knew and some he did not. He listened without choosing. At some point in the small hours without fanfare, the song came on. The ukulele chord. The warm, unhurried voice. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to all 3 minutes and 40 seconds of it without moving. When it ended, he sat for another minute in the quiet it left behind. Then he went to bed. He did not know, lying in the dark, whether he would win tomorrow. He thought the chances were reasonable, but he also understood that reasonable chances meant the other thing was possible, and he lay on his side of the bed and thought about what that would require of him. If they lost, he would request a formal district review. If that went against him, he would go to the state education agency. Patricia Voss had already mapped the path. It was longer than he wanted, and it would cost more than he had easily available. But he had the shop, and he had the bikes, and he had the particular stubbornness of a man who had built things from raw material his whole life and understood that the distance between where you started and where you needed to be was just work. He fell asleep. In the morning, he made oatmeal for Owen and put it on the table, and Owen came downstairs and sat and ate without speaking. He was wearing the button shirt from the wedding because Grady had asked if it was all right to wear it again, and Owen had said yes. The cube was in his left hand. The handkerchief with the letter S was in the breast pocket of the shirt, which Grady had not suggested. Owen had put it there himself. Owen said, "Is Mrs. Galloway going to be there?" Grady said her statement is, "She cannot come because she is teaching." Owen thought about that. He said, "Tell her thank you." Grady said, "I will." Owen finished his oatmeal. He put his bowl in the sink. He picked up his backpack and stood at the door and looked at Grady. He said, "Ready." They drove to the district office, a low brick building on the edge of town, with a parking lot half full of district vehicles. Patricia Voss was waiting in the lobby in a dark suit with a leather bag over her shoulder, the manner of a person who had been there for 20 minutes already. She crouched briefly to Owen's level and said, "Thank you for coming today." Owen looked at her and then at the ceiling and then at Grady, who nodded, and Owen said, "Okay." The conference room was beige with fluorescent lighting, and a long table with 7 chairs on one side and 3 on the other, a pitcher of water, a projector screen at the far end. 7 board members already seated, including Hogan at the far right and 2 district administrators Grady did not recognize. Patricia Voss settled Grady and Owen at the 3-chair side Owen between Grady and the wall, which was the arrangement Grady had asked for. Owen had the cube. He had the headphones around his neck. He looked at the table. The board chair, a woman in her 60s, said they were here to hear the formal appeal of the transfer recommendation for Owen Boone. She said the board had reviewed the procedural question regarding recusal prior to this meeting and had determined that board member Hogan would not participate in today's deliberations or vote pending further review of the relevant governance policy. She said this without looking at Hogan. Hogan sat at the end of the table with a particular stillness. Patricia Voss said the appellant thanks the board for addressing the procedural matter. The chair nodded. She said you may proceed. Patricia Voss presented the case without theatrics. She laid out Owen's 3-year record at Millhaven Elementary. She read 2 paragraphs from Mrs. Galloway's statement aloud, the ones that described the specific environmental adaptations and their documented effect on Owen's distress frequency. She presented Dr. Frost's clinical summary. She laid the conflict of interest documentation on the table as a procedural question that the board had now appropriately addressed by removing Hogan from the vote. She noted that without Hogan's vote, the original decision had been 4-2, and that the grounds for that decision rested on specialist assessments that did not account for the progress documented in the 14 months since those assessments were conducted. Then she said, I would like to show the board a brief video. She connected her laptop to the projector. The clip came up on the screen. 30 seconds. Owen on the edge of a dance floor at a 300-person wedding reception. The cube in his left hand, his feet beginning to move, his mouth opening. Grady did not look at the screen. He looked at Owen. Owen was looking at the table. His left hand moved the cube in the slow rotation he used when he was inside his own thoughts. His right hand was flat on his knee. After a moment without looking up, he reached over and placed his right hand on Grady's forearm. Just set it there, flat like a small, warm weight. Grady put his hand over his son's. On the screen, Owen was singing off-key and quiet and absolutely unaware of being watched. The room was very still. When the clip ended, Patricia Voss said the appellant's position is that this video taken 5 days before this hearing is evidence that Owen Boone's capacity for adaptive social behavior in appropriately structured environments exceeds what the specialist assessments suggested. The appellant submits that the current placement with the documented adaptations in place is providing Owen with the conditions he needs to develop. The appellant further submits that transferring him to a residential facility 3 hours from his home on the basis of assessments that do not reflect his current level of functioning does not serve his best interests. We asked the board to reconsider the transfer recommendation. The chair looked at her colleagues. There was a quiet consultation that lasted several minutes, during which Grady sat with his hand over his son's and looked at the wall behind the chair and did not try to read faces. Owen had not moved. He was still looking at the table, still working the cube. At one point, he exhaled slowly through his nose, the long, deliberate breath he used when he was managing something. Grady pressed his hand slightly, and Owen pressed back without looking up. The board members were quiet among themselves. Grady could not hear what they were saying. He watched Hogan sitting at the end of the table, removed from the deliberation, hands folded, looking at the surface in front of him. The chair said the board will take a brief recess to confer. They were out of the room for 11 minutes. Grady counted. When they came back, they sat down. The chair looked at her papers and then looked up. She said the board has voted to rescind the transfer recommendation for Owen Boone. The vote is 4-2. Owen will remain enrolled at Millhaven Elementary. The board has also voted to formally request that the district's Student Support Services team conduct a review of the accommodations currently in place for Owen and provide recommendations for any additional support that can be implemented within the current placement. She looked up from the paper and looked directly at Grady. She said, Mr. Boone, the board believes Owen belongs at Millhaven. Grady said yes, quietly. He said he does. He looked at Owen. Owen had not changed expression. He was still looking at the table, but his hand on Grady's arm had tightened very slightly and he had not let go. Outside in the parking lot, Patricia Voss shook Grady's hand and then crouched briefly to Owen's level again. She said, you were very good in there today. Owen considered that and said, I did not do anything. She said, sometimes that is exactly the right thing to do. She shook Grady's hand once more and walked to her car. Grady stood in the parking lot with Owen beside him. The October morning was clear and cold and honest. He looked at his son standing next to him in the button shirt, with the handkerchief in the breast pocket, the cube in his left hand. Owen said, can we get breakfast? Grady said, yeah, buddy, we can get breakfast. They drove to a diner on the north side of Millhaven that Owen was comfortable with because he knew the layout and the noise level and the particular waitress who always seated them by the window without being asked. They sat by the window. Owen ordered oatmeal. Grady ordered coffee and eggs and ate without the urgency he had carried for 2 weeks. Owen ate without speaking for a while. Then he said, is that the end of it? Grady said there will be a follow-up review. People coming to the school to look at the setup, make sure you have what you need. But the transfer is off. Owen nodded. He turned the cube once. He said, good. Grady drank his coffee. He looked at his son across the table and thought about 22 days ago, the letter on the counter, the radio turned off before the first note had barely begun. He thought about a gravel lot in October and a woman with silver hair saying, you are doing better than you think you are. He said, hey. Owen looked up. Grady said, you know, Dottie is going to have a baby next fall. He said she is going to have parties and first birthdays and all of that. He said, you want to go to those things, we will go. You want to stay home, we stay home. But we are not going to decide ahead of time. We are going to see. Owen looked at him. He said, like the wedding. Grady said, like the wedding. Owen thought about that. He ate a spoonful of oatmeal. He said, okay. He looked out the window at the street. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look deliberate. Owen had the cube in his left hand and the handkerchief visible at his pocket, and his right hand flat on the table beside his bowl, and he was watching the street outside with the focused expression he used when he was taking something in. He looked settled, present in the room and not trying to be anywhere else. Grady drank his coffee and watched his son and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. That evening, 3 weeks after the wedding, an envelope arrived at the shop. No return address, just his name in careful handwriting, Grady Boone, and the shop's address on Millhaven Road. He opened it at the workbench after Lester had gone home. Inside was a photograph. He turned it over in his hands. It had been taken from outside through the kitchen window at night. The kitchen light was on. Through the glass, you could see 2 figures, a large one, and a small one standing in the middle of the kitchen floor. Moving. The large figure had its hand out, and the small figure had its hand in the large figure's, and they were both moving off the beat without any particular grace in the particular way of people who are dancing because they need to, and not because anyone is watching. He looked at it for a long time. He turned it over. On the back, in the same careful handwriting, 5 words. He is dancing, H. He stood at the workbench for a moment. The shop was quiet around him, just the sound of the cooling equipment and the faint tick of metal settling. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the 2 figures in the window, the large one and the small one, hands together in the kitchen light. He put the photograph in the breast pocket of his jacket over his heart. Then he turned off the shop lights and locked the door and rode home.